Life as a Mohave, 1852 to 1856, Part 2. Olive and Mary Ann's new adoptive family. Upon arriving in the Mohave Valley, Olive and Mary Ann were brought to the house of the chief. Chief in this case was more of an honorary leadership position rather than any kind of monarch or ruler. The chief was called Espanol, which was almost certainly not his name, but perhaps some clumsy pronunciation of his title. As you can tell from my own clumsy pronunciation, it sounds a lot like Español, as in Spanish, in Spanish. Nevertheless, from that very first day, Español took responsibility for Olive and Mary Ann. This included the work duties they were expected to complete, as well as their room and board. The chief's wife, a woman named Aspanio, took a kind and warm-hearted view of the Oatman girls. Olive would later state that Aspanio cared for her and for Mary Ann like an adoptive mother. Olive's post-captivity lectures and writings would gradually move to be quite critical of Indians. But she always spoke highly of Aspanio. Also included in this new adoptive family was the daughter, Topeka. The very same woman that had joined the 5 Mohave men in the party that traded with the Tokapaya for Olive and Mary Ann. Topeka was a few years older than Olive, who was now nearly 15, and the two spent hours together each day. Morning chores, foraging for food, cooking meals, weaving baskets, making pottery. By all accounts, Olive and Topeka grew very close. Over the next several months, Olive and Mary Ann did as they were told, eventually picking up the language, and in so doing, interacting more with the people in the community. There were those who expressed anger, maybe even hatred, toward the whites in general, while others were more curious, asking questions about white culture and beliefs, being rightly amazed at the distance Olive and Mary Ann had traveled with their family. Two common questions. A couple of questions people then and now have had about the 4 years Olive and Mary Ann spent living with the Mohave are: 1. Did Olive and Mary Ann ever try to escape or leave? And 2. Was Olive ever married, and or did she have any children? Olive will have to deal with these questions with nearly everyone she comes into contact with for the rest of her life. Let's briefly address each question. Question 1. Did Olive and Mary Ann ever try to escape or leave? Without getting too deep in the weeds, escape might be a loaded word, just as bought or traded for is different than if the Mohave thought they were adopting the Oatman girls. Nevertheless, it does warrant some consideration. Did they, or should they, have tried to escape or leave the Mohave? Arguments against include pure logistics. They were hundreds of miles from the nearest white settlements, and those miles were over dry deserts and rocky mountains, and they'd be trying to outrun one of the most fleet-footed peoples on the continent, at least if one assumes they were not allowed to leave in the first place. Even if they were somehow not tracked down and found, could Olive and Mary Ann survive the desert heat, the snakes and scorpions, the lack of water? Maybe they picked up enough of the Mohave skill set and were therefore stronger travelers. There is also the question of, to whom would they go? They had some extended family back in Illinois, but that was more than 1,000 miles away. Their siblings and parents were dead, and what kind of life would two young orphaned girls have in the Old West? Though it may sound a little naive, maybe they were actually happy with their adoptive family and being part of the Mohave community. It might be hard to imagine, especially to the white supremacist views of the 19th century, but even to us today, what happens when you begin a completely new life, living in a completely new place, with no communication with the old one? It's also hard to imagine what it took just to survive all that Olive and Mary Ann had already survived, physically and mentally, just to find themselves living with the Mohave. Maybe their possible willingness to be tattooed was itself an indicator that they were committed to living as Mohave, and were not seeking escape or a reason to leave. One incident in 1854 is of particular interest. In February of 1854, 2 full years before Olive would leave the Mohave, another large contingent of surveyors, soldiers, and scientists, this time one connected with the Smithsonian Institute, was led by U.S. Army Lieutenant A.W. Whipple. This contingent was crossing just south of the part of the Mohave Territory where Olive and Mary Ann lived. That is, the area around present-day Needles, California. The Mexican-American War of a decade before, the 1840s, resulted in over 500,000 square miles of land ceded to the Americans that would later include present-day Texas, New Mexico, Colorado, parts of Wyoming, Utah, Nevada, California, and Arizona. Whipple, a topographical engineer by trade, had been sent by Secretary of War and future President of the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis, to survey the 35th parallel across these newly acquired lands for possible railroad routes to connect the Mississippi River to the Pacific Ocean. Footnote: I intentionally mention Jefferson Davis because, only a handful of years away, the Civil War will include several characters from our story of Olive Oatman. Whipple himself will fight in the Civil War for the Union side, dying of his injuries in Lee's masterpiece at the Battle of Chancellorsville. When Whipple and his men arrived in their lands in 1854, the Mohave were very welcoming. Hundreds visited the camp each day to trade for beads, foods, and other supplies. A few of the Mohave even guided some of Whipple's men around the area. And if you're wondering, yes, Whipple's group not only specifically mentions the beauty of the Mohave men, but some of the artists even took time to draw sketches of them. And yes, they also reported on the Mojave's crude jokes and sense of humor. Olive and Mary Ann, then 17 and 12, certainly knew what the Mohave knew, that the U.S. government and other whites were in the area, that a new fort was downriver at Fort Yuma, and that there was a possibility that a message could be sent. But questions remain. Were the Oatman girls hidden away from this group of whites? Were the Mohave asked about Olive and Mary Ann and lied, claiming ignorance? Or did Olive, Mary Ann, and their adoptive family think it best to stay out of view of these white men? Olive makes no mention of these events in her book or her lectures. I don't have any answers here today, but I find the many scenarios fascinating. Question 2. Did Olive get married or have any children? The short answer is probably not. While she was of marrying age for both Mohave and typical 19th century Americans, there isn't any reliable evidence that she had a spouse or any children. One would imagine a spouse or any children would have come with her when she left the Mohave, or would have at least prevented her from leaving in the first place. But this is just conjecture. Perhaps more convincingly, Olive wouldn't have biological children after her time with the Mohave either. There have been writings about how the trauma of the massacre, as well as episodes of near starvation, may have played a part in her possible lack of ability to bear children. For decades after her time with the Mohave, and even after her death, there were many claims of knowing or even being one of her half Mohave children. All claims and stories I was able to find were either more a reflection of the grandiose second or third hand myth-making stories of the times, or, to use a technical term, just flat out bananas. But these stories do exist. Perhaps after this in situ museum, you'll choose to explore some of these yourself. From Olive's iconic facial tattoo to the puritanical origins of America, there are a host of reasons why sexuality, in this case a woman's sexuality, was a hot topic and a source of speculation at the time. You could argue I'm contributing to that right now by mentioning it here. You're probably right. For all Olive and Mary Ann knew, they were to live among the Mohave for the rest of their lives. Whether that be one more day, one more week, one more year, or for decades to come. Assimilating into a culture and a way of life not only seems natural, but rational too. If Olive was going to survive, and if she was going to protect her younger sister, she'd have to make 1,000 like decisions in this new life she found herself in. And, unfortunately, being a woman and of the 19th century, she'd be seen through the lens of those decisions with plenty of judgment for the rest of her life. Stratton, Olive's ghostwriter, bends over backwards to avoid connecting anything: tattoos, rituals, timelines, that would imply anything but the most chaste experience for Olive. It's always been part of the conversation with Olive Oatman. It probably shouldn't be, but that's why it's mentioned here, even if it's likely that I'm being a bit of a hypocrite by not approving of it while still participating in it. Let's get back to our story. And unfortunately, an especially sad part of our story. Mary Ann passes away. In 1855, a year after the Whipple Expedition, Mary Ann Oatman, only 12 years old, passed away. She was a fragile girl, but somehow still made it through her family's massacre and 2 long overland trips to live with the Tokapaya and then the Mohave. 1855 was the girl's 4th year living with the Mohave, and the Mohave were experiencing a severe food shortage. Despite Olive's best efforts, even at her own expense, searching far and wide for any food, as well as Espanio breaking rations protocol to sneak the girls' food, Mary Ann was among those that succumbed. Many other children died as well. Olive later told how Espanio stood by Olive's side over Mary Ann's last days, and how she cried all night long when Mary Ann passed. Espanio's efforts could not save Mary Ann, but they did save Olive. She would pull through and survive. There's a lot of inconsistency around the actual timing of Mary Ann's death. Olive would later report dates that varied widely, from just after leaving the Tokapaya in 1852 to just before leaving the Mohave in 1856. Let's withhold judgment here, as we'll see that Olive is soon going to learn how to manage, for lack of a better term, the details of her story. She would need to have darn good reasons why she stayed and have solid defenses of what she did and did not do during her time with the Mohave. If Mary Ann died 4 years into living with the Mohave, only months before Olive herself returned to white civilization, then she might have a lot to answer for example. What is crystal clear, even in Olive's book and lectures, was that Espanio mourned for Mary Ann and saved Olive's life. As mentioned before, the Mohave would burn the bodies of the dead. But, with Espanio's help, Olive was able to convince Chief Espanol to allow Olive to bury Mary Ann's body. Mary Ann Oatman was buried near the garden that she and Olive shared over these last few years. Mary Ann's death must have brought back to the surface all that trauma of the massacre, the time with the Tokapaya, and Olive's possible guilt over not being able to protect her little sister. Just heartbreaking. Olive was now completely removed from her previous life. Her adoptive Mohave family was all she had left in the world. In the next section, Lorenzo and the search for Olive. But before moving on, a lot of speculation and questions in this section. It's a good reminder of how little we actually know about historical events and the people who lived them. A lot of history is just plain lost. Doesn't make it less interesting or less relevant, just not as concrete and objective as we might wish it to be. Think about our own biases: age, gender, life experiences. A lot of factors paint how we see past events and people. Even the books we read and the movies we watch, the museums we go to. What we'd think we would do in those situations, we don't really know. We can only guess and maybe hope we'd be as strong and as resilient as Olive must have been. Talk it over with your group, and when you're ready, go ahead and play the next section. Lorenzo, February 1851 to 1856.